The snow was coming down so hard it felt like the whole world had turned white. Wind howled through Maple Ridge, Colorado, and my driveway was already buried again even though I had just finished clearing it with the brand new snowblower I bought using my year-end bonus. I shut the machine off, feeling relieved for the first time all morning when I noticed someone trudging toward me through knee-high snow. It was Heather Cole, our HOA president, still perfectly styled despite the storm, marching like she owned the ground beneath my feet. Without even saying hello, she told me the HOA needed my snowblower for community use. Not asked, needed. She claimed the bylaws allowed the board to seize personal property during emergencies and said this storm qualified. I calmly told her no. I explained it was mine, and I already helped neighbors when I could. The moment that word left my mouth, her smile froze harder than the driveway. Her eyes went cold, and she warned me I was being uncooperative and that I'd regret it. As she stormed off, I stood there in the snow with a sinking feeling. I didn't just refuse a request, I challenged her control. And I had no idea yet that this one moment would explode into fines, threats, and a legal nightmare that would expose far more than HOA bullying. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When I first moved to Maple Ridge, Colorado, it was because I wanted quiet. Not excitement, not drama. Just a safe neighborhood where people waved when you passed them on the sidewalk and didn't feel the need to control each other's lives. I had spent years saving up, and buying that house felt like finally planting my feet somewhere solid. At the time, the HOA seemed harmless. The rules were basic, the meetings were short, and most people barely paid attention to them at all. That changed when Heather Cole became president. At first, it was subtle. A new newsletter that felt more like a warning label than community news. Slightly harsher language in violation notices. Then the tone shifted completely. Everything became about appearances. Lawns had to look identical. Decorations had to be approved weeks in advance. Complaints were no longer handled quietly. They were broadcast. Heather loved order, but not the helpful kind. She loved authority. She walked around the neighborhood like she was inspecting a showroom, clipboard in hand, smiling just enough to remind you she was watching. And the more people complied, the bolder she got. What bothered me most was how fake the word community became under her leadership. Heather talked about it constantly, but she didn't practice it. Real community, at least to me, meant choice. It meant helping because you wanted to, not because someone threatened you. That's how I had always lived there. When winter storms rolled through, I checked on people. I cleared my own driveway first, sure, but if I saw someone struggling, especially older neighbors, I helped. Mrs. Espaird, Evelyn Brooks, lived 2 houses down from me. She was in her late 70s and still fiercely independent, but snowstorms hit her hard. Every time it snowed, I cleared her walkway and driveway without her asking. She'd insist on giving me cookies or hot coffee afterward, and I joked that it was a fair trade. I did the same for a few others when I could. Sometimes people offered to return the favor. Sometimes they didn't. That was fine. No one kept score. So when Heather demanded my snowblower for community use, it felt insulting on a personal level. Not just because it was my property, but because she was trying to turn voluntary kindness into mandatory compliance. She wasn't interested in helping people like Mrs. People, like Mrs. Brooks. She was interested in controlling resources. The next HOA meeting made that painfully clear. The room was more crowded than usual, which was never a good sign. Word had spread about the snowblower incident, and Heather clearly knew it. She stood at the front with her arms crossed, waiting until everyone settled before launching into a speech about fairness and shared responsibility. Without using my name at first, she described a homeowner who refused to cooperate during an emergency. She talked about inequality, about how some residents had tools, others didn't, and how that imbalance created tension. Then she looked straight at me and said it plainly. She called my refusal selfish. I could feel every eye in the room turn toward me. I spoke up, calmly. I explained that I already helped neighbors when they asked, and that I believed help should be voluntary. I said nothing in the bylaws gave the HOA the right to take personal equipment just because someone else wanted to use it. That's when Alan Pierce finally spoke. Alan was the treasurer. Quiet, reserved, the kind of guy who actually read documents instead of skimming them. He cleared his throat and said he wasn't sure the emergency clause Heather was citing applied here. From his understanding, it was meant for life-threatening situations, not convenience. Heather didn't even let him finish. She cut him off mid-sentence, told him he was misinterpreting the intent, and reminded everyone that the board had authority to act in the best interest of the community. Her voice was sharp, rehearsed, final. The tension in the room was thick. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded along, either afraid or unwilling to get involved. The meeting ended abruptly, with Heather promising to address the issue moving forward. Walking out, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't about snow. It wasn't about equipment. It wasn't even about rules. Heather didn't care whether I helped people or not. She cared that I had said no. And in her world, no was unacceptable. From that moment on, I knew she wasn't going to let it go. And whatever came next was going to be about one thing only, making sure everyone understood who was in charge. The first violation notice arrived 3 days later, slid into my mailbox like a passive-aggressive threat. I remember standing in my kitchen, reading it twice because I honestly thought it had to be a joke. The HOA was fining me for unsightly snow patterns left behind by my snowblower. According to the letter, the tracks disrupted the visual uniformity of the neighborhood. No, patterns. I actually laughed at first, out loud. Then the laughter faded when I realized Heather had signed it personally. That was when it hit me. This wasn't random. This was punishment. I disputed the notice in writing the same day, keeping my tone polite and factual. I cited the bylaws. I asked for clarification on what exactly qualified as an unsightly pattern during an active snowstorm. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I just asked for an explanation. I never got one. Instead, a second notice arrived less than a week later. This time, it was for my trash bin being visible too early on collection day. According to the HOA, it had been placed near the curb before the approved time window. The problem was, I knew that wasn't true. I had taken it out that morning, the same time I always did, just like everyone else on my street. I started paying attention then, really paying attention. Other bins were out earlier than mine. Some were tipped over from the wind. None of them received notices, just me. Around the same time, Heather became very active on the neighborhood Facebook group. She never used my name, but she didn't have to. She posted long lectures about entitled behavior and certain residents who believe rules don't apply to them. She talked about how some people hoarded resources during emergencies and lacked community spirit. People reacted with confused comments and nervous likes. A few asked what she was talking about. Heather ignored those questions completely. Seeing my character dragged publicly without the chance to respond made my stomach knot. I had lived there quietly for years, helped people without expecting anything back, and suddenly I was being painted as the problem. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I didn't submit. I tried again to resolve it the right way. I sent a formal letter to the HOA board requesting clarification on the violations and asking for a copy of the financial records Heather had referenced at the last meeting. I knew the bylaws allowed homeowners to request transparency, and I framed it as a routine inquiry. I even thanked the board for their time. Heather's response came fast, and it wasn't subtle. She didn't answer my questions. Instead, she informed me that failure to comply with HOA directives could result in further enforcement actions. She reminded me that unpaid fines could accumulate and lead to additional remedies. The language was cold, legal, threatening. That was the moment my anxiety really set in. I started checking my mailbox with dread. Every envelope felt heavy. I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if I should have just given in at the start. Maybe it would have been easier. Maybe none of this would have happened if I had just handed over the snowblower and swallowed my pride. But then I thought about what that would mean. It wouldn't have ended there. People like Heather don't stop when you give them what they want. They learn that pressure works. And once that happens, everything becomes negotiable under threat. I couldn't sleep well. I kept imagining what else she could do. Could she mess with my credit? Could she make it difficult to sell my house someday? I had worked too hard to let someone with a clipboard and a title bully me out of peace. Still, I stayed calm. Outwardly, at least. I documented everything. I saved screenshots of the Facebook posts. I kept copies of every notice, every email, every letter. I stopped engaging emotionally and started responding only in writing, always polite, always factual. Heather didn't like that at all. Her next message dropped any pretense of cooperation. She accused me of being hostile and claimed my repeated questions were disruptive. She warned that continued resistance could lead to serious consequences under HOA enforcement powers. Reading that, something finally clicked into place. This had never been about snow patterns, or trash bins, or bylaws. Those were just tools. Excuses. What Heather really wanted was compliance. Silence. Submission. The rules only mattered when they helped her maintain control. And I realized something else too, something that made my frustration harden into resolve. If she was willing to go this far over a snowblower, then whatever power she had, she was used to using it without anyone pushing back. That meant I probably wasn't the first. And I wouldn't be the last. The situation had crossed a line. This wasn't petty anymore. It was personal. And whether I liked it or not, I was already in it deep. The only question left was how far Heather was willing to go to prove she was in charge, and how much I was willing to endure before I stopped playing defense. A week after the last warning email, my phone rang late in the evening. I almost ignored it. By that point, every unexpected call made my chest tighten. But when I saw the name on the screen, I paused. It was Alan Pierce. We had never spoken one-on-one before. At meetings, he barely said a word, so when I answered and heard the tension in his voice, I knew this wasn't a friendly check-in. He asked if we could talk somewhere private, not over the phone, not through email. He suggested my place that same night and said he didn't want to be seen going to mine. That alone told me something was wrong. When Alan arrived, he didn't sit down right away. He stood in my living room, holding a thin folder like it weighed 100 pounds. His hands were shaking. Finally, he exhaled and told me he hadn't planned on getting involved. He said he liked numbers, not conflict, and he'd stayed quiet for years because it felt safer that way. Then he opened the folder. Inside were printed account summaries from the HOA's operating account. Alan explained that after the snowblower dispute, something about Heather's behavior had started bothering him. The urgency. The way she shut him down when he mentioned bylaws. The way she avoided financial questions. So he did what he was supposed to do as treasurer. He looked closer. What he found didn't make sense. There were payments listed to snow removal and landscaping companies I had never heard of. Names that sounded legitimate at first glance, but vague enough to avoid scrutiny. Alan had tried calling them. The numbers were disconnected. He searched for business registrations. Nothing came up. He slid one page toward me and pointed to a line item. Then another, and another. Over the past 2 years, tens of thousands of dollars had been paid out to companies that didn't exist. I remember staring at the numbers, my mind struggling to catch up. This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. This was deliberate, repeated, structured. Alan swallowed hard and said the worst part wasn't just the money, it was the timing. Every time someone asked questions or pushed back at meetings, large transfers followed shortly after, almost like someone was nervous, almost like someone was trying to stay ahead of discovery. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Heather's fixation on control, her obsession with compliance, her intolerance for questions. The snowblower wasn't the problem. I wasn't the problem. I was a threat because I didn't play along, and because I asked for transparency. Control wasn't just her personality, it was her shield. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the heater filling the room. I felt a strange mix of anger and clarity. The fines, the warnings, the public shaming, none of it was random. It was defensive. She wasn't punishing me because I said no. She was trying to scare me into backing off before I noticed something bigger. Alan admitted he was scared. If Heather found out he had copies of these records, she could remove him, retaliate, or worse. He asked me what I planned to do. I told him the truth. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. People like Heather thrived on confrontation. They twisted it, used it. What mattered now was proof. From that night on, everything changed. We stopped talking casually and started communicating carefully. Every message was documented, every file was duplicated and stored in more than one place. Alan continued doing his job as if nothing had changed, quietly gathering records, matching transactions, building a timeline. I stopped responding emotionally to Heather altogether. No explanations, no arguments. Only formal, written replies. I could feel her frustration growing even without direct contact. The violations increased, but so did her mistakes. Dates didn't line up. References contradicted earlier statements. Pressure makes cracks. The fear I had been living with slowly transformed into something steadier. Focus. Purpose. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was uncovering something that affected every homeowner in that neighborhood. One night, as I reviewed another batch of documents Alan had sent, I realized how close Heather must be to losing control. That explained the escalation, the threats, the need to dominate the narrative. She wasn't confident. She was desperate, and desperation makes people reckless. This was no longer an HOA dispute about rules or snow or aesthetics. It was about misuse of power and stolen trust. What started with the demand in a snowstorm had turned into something much darker. I didn't know yet how it would end. I didn't know how far Heather would go once she realized the walls were closing in, but I did know one thing for certain. This was the turning point. From here on out, there was no going back to normal. By the time I called Jason Hale, I already knew this had crossed into territory I couldn't handle alone. Jason and I had been friends since college, and while we'd gone in different directions after graduation, we stayed in touch. He became an attorney specializing in property and civil disputes. I became the guy who tried to mind his business and live quietly. When I told him everything from the snowblower demand to the missing HOA funds, he didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line. Then he said something that stuck with me. "This isn't about winning an argument," he said. "This is about protecting yourself." Jason helped me do what I should have done earlier, but now with precision. We formally disputed every fine in writing. Not emotionally, not defensively. Each response cited the bylaws, requested clarification, and demanded documentation. We also submitted official records, requests for financial statements, vendor contracts, and board meeting minutes. Everything went out certified. Everything was tracked. Heather's response was swift and brutal. Instead of answering a single question, she sent notice that my unpaid fines were accumulating and that the HOA was exercising its authority to place a lien on my home. When I read that letter, my hands went cold. A lien wasn't just a scare tactic. It was real. It could affect my credit. It could complicate refinancing, It could follow me for years. That was the moment the anxiety tried to swallow me whole. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the letter while snow fell quietly outside, thinking about how fragile everything suddenly felt. I had done nothing wrong. I had followed the rules. And still, someone with a title and a temper could threaten my home. Jason's reaction was immediate. He told me not to panic and not to respond directly. A lien placed in retaliation for disputed fines, especially while records requests were pending, was a serious overreach. He said Heather wasn't acting from a position of strength. She was acting from fear. That fear showed. The violations multiplied, but the quality dropped. Notices referenced incorrect dates. One cited a rule that didn't exist. Another contradicted an earlier warning. Heather was rushing. Sloppy. Every attempt to intimidate me left a deeper paper trail. At the same time, something unexpected started happening. Neighbors began reaching out. It started quietly. A message from someone 2 streets over asking if I was the one Heather was targeting. Then a knock on my door from a couple I barely knew, saying they had seen the Facebook posts and wanted to check in. Once people realized I wasn't backing down, they felt safer talking. The stories poured out. One neighbor had been fined repeatedly for decorations that had been approved years earlier. Another had been threatened with legal action for questioning budget increases. Mrs. Brooks told me Heather once warned her about liability issues if she accepted help from neighbors instead of using HOA services. It wasn't random. It was systematic. Heather bullied anyone who asked questions, anyone who didn't comply fast enough, anyone who reminded her she wasn't untouchable. Jason helped me understand something critical. HOAs rely on silence. Most people don't fight back because it's exhausting, intimidating, and confusing by design. Heather thrived in that environment, but the moment people compared notes, her authority weakened. That's when the plan took shape. We weren't going to ambush her. We weren't going to argue with her. We were going to expose facts. Alan continued quietly gathering financial records. Jason began drafting filings to challenge the lien and preserve my rights. Meanwhile, I spoke with neighbors, not to rally them emotionally, but to inform them. I showed them documents, screenshots, timelines. I told them what I knew and what I didn't. The response was anger, but also relief. People finally understood they weren't alone. Together, we reviewed the bylaws and found the mechanism Heather had always counted on no one using. A petition. With enough homeowner signatures, the board could be forced into a special meeting and leadership could be challenged. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fast. But it was legal. Sunlight does something powerful. It changes the balance. Heather noticed the shift. Her emails grew sharper, her language more defensive. She accused me of stirring unrest and undermining the community. Jason smiled when I read those to him. She's narrating her own downfall, he said. The lien that was supposed to silence me did the opposite. It clarified everything. Heather wasn't enforcing rules anymore. She was protecting herself, and she was willing to hurt anyone who got in the way. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. This was bigger than me now. Bigger than a snowblower. Bigger than fines or pride. It was about stopping someone who believed authority meant immunity. And once that belief cracks, everything starts to fall apart. The days leading up to the special HOA meeting felt like standing under a storm cloud that refused to move. Once the petition crossed the required threshold, the meeting was unavoidable, and Heather knew it. Her response wasn't calm or professional. It was frantic. My inbox flooded with mass emails sent to the entire neighborhood. In them, Heather accused me of harassment, of spreading misinformation, and of deliberately undermining community harmony. She claimed I was hoarding resources during emergencies and stirring up fear for my own benefit. She never mentioned the financial questions. She never mentioned the records requests. She never mentioned the missing money. She didn't have to name me. Everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. Neighbors started forwarding the emails to me with short messages attached. Is she serious? This feels unhinged. She sent this at 2 in the morning. Each one made it clearer that Heather wasn't in control anymore. She was reacting, not leading. I tried to stay focused, but the pressure was real. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped. I double-checked the locks at night. I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if I had missed something or pushed too hard. Jason reminded me that this stage always felt like this. When someone who relies on intimidation starts losing it, they get loud. The night before the meeting, I learned how loud desperation could get. I woke up early that morning to get coffee before work. When I stepped outside, something felt wrong immediately. My car was sitting at an odd angle. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. All 4 tires were flat, completely shredded. For a few seconds, I just stood there in the cold, staring. My first thought wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Then fear crept in, slow and heavy. This wasn't an HOA notice. This wasn't an email. This was physical. I called the police. While I waited, I took photos, hands shaking, trying to stay methodical. When the officer arrived, he was calm but serious. He asked about recent disputes, threats, anyone who might have a motive. I told him everything: the HOA, the fines, the lien. The meeting scheduled for the next day. He didn't brush it off. He told me vandalism like that, especially tied to an ongoing dispute, was taken seriously. A report was filed. He suggested installing cameras immediately and asked if I felt safe staying there overnight. After he left, I sat in my living room for a long time, the silence pressing in. Fear tried to take over, but something else pushed back harder. Anger, yes, but also clarity. Whoever did this wanted me scared enough to back off. It had the opposite effect. That afternoon, cameras went up around my house. Jason helped arrange it. Neighbors offered to keep an eye out. Mrs. Brooks called to check on me, her voice worried but firm. She told me she was proud of me for standing up. Later that evening, Jason called with an update that shifted everything. He told me law enforcement had officially opened an investigation into the HOA's finances. Subpoenas were in motion. Accounts were being reviewed. Heather no longer had the luxury of pretending this was just neighborhood drama. The pieces snapped together. The emails, the escalating threats, the vandalism. Heather wasn't trying to win an argument anymore. She was trying to survive exposure. That night, I didn't sleep much. But I wasn't panicking. I was steady. By morning, word about the tires had spread. People stopped by, not to gossip, but to offer support. Some brought coffee. Others brought copies of emails Heather had sent them over the years. Each story sounded familiar. Each one painted the same picture. When I looked around my living room, now cluttered with documents and quiet determination, I realized something important. Heather's power had always depended on isolation, on keeping people scared and separate. Now she had done the one thing she couldn't undo. She had crossed a line so visible that no one could pretend not to see it. As the meeting approached, I felt the fear fade, replaced by resolve. Heather might still be loud. She might still try to control the narrative. But behind the scenes, the truth was already moving. And once truth gets momentum, no amount of intimidation can stop it. The community center had never been that full before. People were standing along the walls, sitting on folding chairs, pulled in from other rooms, whispering to each other in tight clusters. The air felt heavy, charged with something close to electricity. When I walked in, conversations paused. Not because people were afraid, but because they were watching. Everyone knew this meeting wasn't going to be routine. Heather arrived late. She swept in with a rigid smile and a stack of papers clutched to her chest, heels clicking too loudly against the tile floor. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't make eye contact. She went straight to the front table and dropped into her chair like she was bracing for impact. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't look confident. She looked cornered. Alan stood when the meeting was called to order. His voice shook at first, but he steadied himself quickly. He explained that this was a special meeting triggered by a valid homeowner petition and that the purpose was to address concerns regarding leadership and financial management. Heather tried to interrupt him immediately, claiming the meeting itself was illegitimate. No one listened. Alan began presenting documents, not opinions, not accusations, records. He projected spreadsheets onto the screen behind him. Line items, dates, vendor names. He explained, calmly and clearly, that multiple companies paid by the HOA could not be verified. No business registrations. No active phone numbers. No physical addresses. A murmur rippled through the room. People pulled out their phones. Someone in the back typed one of the vendor names into a search engine and laughed nervously when nothing came up. Another neighbor stood and said they worked in accounting and that the payment patterns didn't make sense. Real-time fact-checking unfolded right there, impossible to ignore. Heather snapped. She jumped to her feet, pointing at Alan, then at me, then at the crowd. She accused us of collusion. She said this was a coordinated attack. She claimed the documents were fabricated and shouted that she was being targeted because she enforced rules others were too weak to uphold. Her voice rose with every sentence. The more evidence Alan presented, the louder she became. She tried to redirect the conversation back to me, yelling about the snowblower, about resource hoarding, about how I had started all of this by refusing to cooperate. The room didn't respond the way she expected. No one defended her. People stared. Some shook their heads. Others whispered things like, "This explains everything," and "She said the same thing to me." Heather looked around, searching for support that wasn't there. Patricia, one of her loudest allies, sat frozen, eyes glued to the table. Then Alan said the words Heather clearly hadn't expected to hear spoken out loud. He confirmed that law enforcement had been notified and that an active investigation into the HOA's finances was underway. The room went silent. Heather's face drained of color. For a brief moment, she looked small. Then the anger surged back, wild and uncontrolled. She slammed her hand on the table and shouted that this was harassment, that she would sue everyone, that she had done nothing wrong. Her voice cracked. Jason stood then, calm and composed. He explained the legal process, the rights of homeowners, and the reason this meeting mattered. He made it clear that tonight wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about trust, and that trust had been broken beyond repair. When the vote was called, it happened quickly. Ballots were distributed, collected, counted. The result wasn't close. Heather was removed as HOA president by an overwhelming margin. The moment the outcome was announced, something shifted in the room. A collective exhale. Relief mixed with disbelief. People looked at each other like they had just woken up from a long, uncomfortable dream. Heather stared at the numbers as if they were written in another language. She tried to speak again, but no one acknowledged her. The authority she had wielded for years evaporated in seconds. She gathered her papers with shaking hands, knocking a few to the floor. No one helped her. She turned toward the door, paused, and looked back once, her expression a mix of rage and humiliation. Then she stormed out. The door slammed behind her, loud enough to echo through the room. No one followed. As people slowly began to talk again, I realized something profound. Heather hadn't lost because of one person standing up to her. She lost because once the fear broke, it broke everywhere at once. The power she thought she had was never real. It was borrowed from silence. And that silence was finally gone. The days after the meeting felt strangely quiet, like the neighborhood itself was catching its breath. The noise, the tension, the constant stream of emails and notices all stopped at once. Heather's name disappeared from inboxes. The HOA website went dark for a few days, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night without waking up anxious. The legal consequences moved faster than I expected. Law enforcement formally confirmed what we already knew. Heather was being investigated for embezzlement tied to the fake vendors Alan had uncovered, and the vandalism to my vehicle was added to the case. Seeing those words in writing made everything feel real in a way meetings and arguments never did. This wasn't gossip or HOA drama anymore. This was accountability. Jason handled the lien issue immediately. Once the investigation was acknowledged, the HOA's legal counsel moved fast to distance the association from Heather's actions. The lien on my home was removed quietly, almost apologetically. No announcement. No explanation. Just a letter confirming it was gone, as if it had never existed. I held that letter for a long time before putting it down, letting the relief sink in. Alan stepped in as interim leadership alongside a small group of board members who had stayed quiet for years out of fear. The changes were immediate and visible. Financial reports were shared openly. Meetings were scheduled at reasonable times and actually included homeowner input. For the first time since I'd lived there, the word community started to feel real again. Neighbors who barely spoke before began checking in on each other. People waved again. Laughed again. It felt like something heavy had been lifted, something we didn't even realize we were all carrying. I thought that would be the end of it. Then, one afternoon, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Heather was standing there alone. She looked nothing like the woman who used to patrol the neighborhood with a clipboard and a smile sharpened like a blade. Her shoulders were slumped. Her eyes were red. She held an envelope in both hands, like she was afraid it might disappear if she let go. She didn't try to argue. She didn't accuse. She didn't even ask to come inside. She handed me the envelope and said she was sorry. Inside was a handwritten letter. In it, she admitted to harassing me, abusing her position, and using fines and threats to intimidate people into silence. She didn't fully confess to the financial crimes, likely on advice from an attorney, but the acknowledgement of wrongdoing was clear. It wasn't polished. It wasn't defensive. It was raw. She told me she had lost everything that mattered to her. Her position, her reputation, her sense of control. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. She just wanted it on record that she knew what she had done. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, she nodded once, turned, and walked away without waiting for a response. I closed the door and stood there for a long time, holding that letter. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt tired and sad, not for what she lost, but for how unnecessary it all was. None of this had to happen if she had just respected a simple no. Later that evening, snow started falling again. Another quiet storm, nothing like the one that started it all, but enough to blanket the street. I stepped outside to clear my driveway and noticed something across the way. Heather's driveway was untouched, completely buried. No tire tracks, no footprints, just snow. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I turned the snowblower toward her house and cleared it. I didn't do it to forgive her. I didn't do it to make a statement. I did it because I could. Because I always had. Because I never needed authority, titles, or fear to be a decent neighbor. When I finished, I shut off the machine and stood there in the quiet, snow still drifting down, feeling something close to peace. Heather had tried to take my snowblower to control people. In the end, it stayed exactly where it belonged, in my hands, on my terms, and that made all the difference. When everything finally settled, what stayed with me wasn't the anger or the fear. It was the clarity. I learned how fragile peace can be when people confuse authority with entitlement, and how dangerous an HOA becomes when no one is willing to speak up. Rules aren't the problem. Silence is. The moment everyone assumes someone else will push back, power collects in the hands of the wrong person. Heather lost everything because she couldn't accept one simple word, no, not shouted, not rude, just calm and firm. That refusal shattered the illusion she depended on. Once people saw that she could be challenged, everything else followed. The secret surfaced. The intimidation failed. The truth did what it always does when it finally gets air. The neighborhood didn't win because of revenge or humiliation. We won because accountability replaced fear. Meetings became open again. Finances became visible. Neighbors started talking instead of whispering. The place I moved into for peace finally felt like home again. Some evenings now, when snow falls quietly and the street is still, I look out at my garage and see the snowblower sitting right where it's always been. It was never a community resource. It was never leverage. It was just a tool. What mattered was the choice to help, not the threat to comply. Real community isn't enforced with fines or warnings or liens. It's built when people are free to say yes, and just as free to say no. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?